Imagine a bare earth floor, cold beneath you. Your body aches, heavy with the burden of your fourth pregnancy in just 6 years. You are a girl, barely 17, yet your womb has become a revolving door of life and loss. None of these children are truly yours anymore. The first, a boy, ripped from your arms at the tender age of 3. You can still feel the faint imprint of his face pressed against your chest that last morning. You can still hear the raw, guttural sound he made as they tore him away, a sound that haunts your nightmares, a phantom echo in the silence of your sleep. The second, a girl, taken to a distant plantation in Mississippi when she was just 18 months old. Her name, if she ever had one in their ledgers, you never learned. To them, she was not a child, but a number, an entry, a price tag, just inventory. The third, a quiet tragedy. She died inside you, the overseer's whip, a brutal lash across your back in your 7th month. A punishment for not picking cotton fast enough. They forced you to dig a shallow grave in the earth, to lie face down, your swollen belly protected in the hollow, while the whip tore at your exposed flesh. It didn't matter. You lost her anyway. Now, a fourth life stirs within you, and with chilling certainty, you already know this one, too, will be taken. Because you are not a mother in their eyes. You are a breeder. That is the chilling language of the plantation ledgers, where you are itemized alongside cattle. Your name is absent. Only your age, your perceived health, and a single, defining word: fertile. This is America 1842, Virginia, and this agonizing reality, it is not a crime, it is not considered abuse, it is not even unusual, it is an industry. They cloaked it in the benign term, natural increase. But there was nothing natural about this monstrous enterprise. This is the untold story of the breeding farms, the darkest, most deliberately obscured chapter of American slavery, deliberately erased from the textbooks, a hidden engine that fueled an empire of cruelty. The 1808 ban on the transatlantic slave trade was initially hailed as a humanitarian victory that would starve the institution of its lifeblood. However, the reality was far more sinister, as it merely closed the front door while forcing a domestic monster to grow in the shadows. Instead of the predicted decline, slavery underwent a radical mutation that shifted the focus from the high seas to the internal geography of the American South. This legislative pivot did not liberate anyone. Rather, it signaled the beginning of a cold, calculated effort to manufacture human beings on American soil. The severance of the African supply line forced the Southern economy to look inward, turning the biological process of birth into a commercial industrial complex. By ending the importation of people, the government inadvertently gave rise to a horrifying domestic breeding industry that would define the next half-century of American history. As the external trade died, the demand for labor in the Deep South reached a fever pitch due to the relentless expansion of the Cotton Kingdom. Planters in states like Virginia and Maryland found themselves with surplus laborers, but exhausted soil, leading them to a grim realization about their assets. They pivoted from traditional agriculture to a more lucrative form of harvesting, the systematic forced reproduction of the people they held in bondage. Every birth became a financial windfall, a way to replenish the workforce without the overhead costs of purchasing from foreign traders. This shift fundamentally altered the experience of enslaved women, whose value was no longer tied solely to their strength in the fields. Their worth was now dictated by the frequency of their pregnancies and the health of the increase. They could provide for the market. This new domestic industry was built on a foundation of extreme psychological and physical terror that weaponized the most intimate parts of human life. The 1808 ban incentivized slaveholders to monitor and control every aspect of reproduction to ensure a steady stream of capital stock for the expanding frontier. Women were no longer viewed as human beings with agency over their bodies, but as biological machines designed to produce a specific, high-value product. The natural increase, celebrated by politicians, was actually a result of coercion, where the sanctity of family was sacrificed at the altar of economic growth. This era saw the rise of specialized breeding plantations where the standard of living was calculated purely to maximize the number of surviving infants. The law meant to limit the reach of slavery had instead forced it to entrench itself deeper into the very womb of the enslaved population. Furthermore, the ban created a massive internal migration known as the Second Middle Passage, where hundreds of thousands were sold from the Upper South. Because people could no longer be brought across the ocean, the children born on breeding farms became the primary exports, moving toward the Gulf Coast. This created a cycle of perpetual trauma, where families were shattered as soon as a child reached a marketable age for the cotton fields. The internal market became even more efficient and brutal than the transatlantic trade had ever been, as it operated under the protection of American law. It turned the domestic landscape into a vast network of holding pens, auction blocks, and transport coffles that stretched for thousands of miles. The tragedy of 1808 is that it made the exploitation of black bodies a strictly American enterprise, insulated from international interference. Ultimately, the transformation following the 1808 ban proves that the American slave trade was not a dying relic but an adaptable and evolving economic engine. By cutting off the African supply, the United States forced the institution of slavery to become self-sustaining through the most horrific means imaginable. This period saw the total commodification of human life, where even the unborn were factored into the net worth of a plantation owner's estate. The breeding farms were the direct result of a policy that sought to appear moral while leaving the underlying economic hunger for labor completely untouched. We must recognize that the ban did not represent the beginning of the end, but rather the birth of a more focused, domestic cruelty. It solidified a system where the product was home-grown, ensuring that the shadows of this dark industry would linger for generations to come. The shift from traditional farming to the systematic breeding of humans represented a cold-blooded pivot in the economic survival of the Upper South. States like Virginia and Maryland had exhausted their soil through centuries of tobacco cultivation, leaving their aristocratic planter class on the brink of financial ruin. They realized their most profitable crop was no longer rooted in the earth, but was being born in the slave cabins behind their mansions. By treating the forced reproduction of enslaved people as a primary source of income, these states transformed into the engine room for American expansion. This transition turned the biological reality of birth into a calculated industrial process designed to save the flagging economies of the northern slave states. The natural increase of the enslaved population became the secret fuel for a nation that was hungry for westward territorial growth. As the Upper South became a nursery for labor, the Deep South emerged as a ravenous consumer of these human assets to fuel its cotton empire. The invention of the cotton gin had made large-scale production incredibly lucrative, but it required an endless supply of physical bodies to endure the brutal heat of the fields. Because the foreign slave trade was closed, the pioneer planters of Mississippi and Louisiana looked back toward the east to buy the people they needed. This created a massive internal market where human beings were treated as a fungible commodity, moving in a steady stream toward the frontier. The economic prosperity of the burgeoning cotton kingdom was entirely dependent on the successful rearing of children on the breeding farms of Virginia. Without this internal pipeline of human labor, the rapid settlement of the American West would have stalled and the cotton industry would have collapsed. The sheer scale of this trade turned the Upper South into a specialized hub for what was essentially a human manufacturing and distribution network. Richmond and Baltimore became the financial centers of this industry, housing massive slave jails and auction houses that operated with high-stakes corporate efficiency. Traders would travel through the rural counties of Virginia, specifically looking for breeding stock that could provide a high return on investment. These middlemen acted as the connective tissue between the struggling tobacco farmers of the North and the wealthy sugar and cotton barons of the South. Every child born into this system was immediately assigned a future market value, often sold away long before they reached adulthood to settle debts. This economic symbiosis between the regions ensured that every part of the American South was complicit in the industrialization of human reproduction. This economic engine was so successful that it fundamentally altered the way the American legal and financial systems viewed the concept of property. Enslaved people were not just labor, they were the primary form of wealth and collateral that supported the entire Southern banking and credit system. A planter's net worth was often determined by the fertility of the women he owned, as their future increase was factored into his creditworthiness. This created a perverse incentive to maximize the birth rate through any means necessary, including forced pairings and the brutal punishment of those who resisted. The domestic trade was so profitable that it surpassed the value of almost every other industry in the United States, including railroads and manufacturing. It was a self-sustaining cycle of exploitation where the reproduction of the worker was just as important as the work the worker performed. Ultimately, the breeding farms served as the foundational machinery that allowed the American South to become a global economic powerhouse during the 19th century. The wealth generated from this trade was not limited to the planters themselves. It flowed into the pockets of northern insurers, shippers, and textile manufacturers. This interconnected web of profit meant that the entire nation was a stakeholder in the horrific rearing of human beings for the market. The tragedy of this economic success is that it was built upon the systematic destruction of black families and the commodification of the womb. We cannot understand the rapid rise of the American economy without acknowledging that its primary engine was the forced labor of millions born into bondage. The legacy of this trade remains a dark testament to a time when human life was the most valuable currency in the land. The dehumanization of enslaved people reached its most chilling peak when it was codified into the language of the nation's elite intellectuals and political leaders. Figures like Thomas Jefferson, who famously penned the ideals of liberty, simultaneously viewed the people he owned through the cold, calculating lens of an accountant. He famously observed that the labor of enslaved women was secondary to their reproductive capacity, noting that their children added a consistent 4% to his capital stock. This perspective transformed the miracle of birth into a predictable financial metric, stripping away the humanity of the mother and replacing it with a dollar sign. By framing human reproduction as a form of interest on an investment, the leadership of America validated a system of industrial breeding. The very architects of American democracy were also the primary theorists who defined human beings as taxable, breedable, and depreciable property. This ideological framework allowed the planter class to justify the most intimate forms of exploitation as necessary components of a successful business model. In the ledgers of the wealthy, enslaved women were often categorized under the same stock headings as horses, cattle, and swine to track the estate's growth. This was not a mere lack of empathy, but a deliberate psychological distance created to facilitate the horrific mechanics of a domestic breeding industry. When a child was born, they were recorded as increase, a term that erased the parental bond and replaced it with a statement of rising net worth. Such language served as a shield, protecting the enslaver from the moral weight of their actions while ensuring the maximum extraction of value. This systemic dehumanization was the essential lubricant that allowed the gears of the American slave trade to grind forward without legal or social friction. The legal system reinforced this clinical view by defining the status of the child based solely on the condition of the mother, a doctrine known as partus sequitur ventrum. This meant that the womb of an enslaved woman was effectively a factory for the state, producing a perpetual supply of laborers who were born into debt. Laws were crafted to ensure that the capital stock could never be depleted, turning the biological act of survival into a source of permanent wealth for the owner. Because the child belonged to the owner from the moment of conception, the concept of a black family was legally non-existent in the eyes of the courts. This doctrine incentivized the sexual exploitation and forced pairing of enslaved people, as every pregnancy was a legally protected gain for the plantation's portfolio. The law did not see a woman in labor. It saw a private asset maturing to its full economic potential. The pervasive use of livestock terminology created a culture where the physical examination of human beings was performed with the detached scrutiny of a veterinarian. At slave markets and on plantation porches, the bodies of young women were poked, prodded, and measured to determine their future capacity for bearing. Their hips, teeth, and general constitution were analyzed not for health or longevity, but for their ability to withstand the rigors of repeated, forced pregnancies. This clinical environment stripped the enslaved of their dignity, reducing their entire existence to a set of biological traits that could be bought and sold. By speaking of people in terms of breeding stock and good breeders, the society normalized a level of cruelty that would otherwise be unbearable. This vocabulary of the market ensured that even the most horrific acts of violence were viewed as simple management of a valuable and productive resource. Ultimately, the dehumanization of enslaved people served as the moral and intellectual foundation upon which the entire American economy was built. By convincing themselves and the world that black people were a different class of property, enslavers could claim to be men of honor while participating in human trafficking. This double-think allowed the wealth of the nation to grow exponentially as human increase provided a self-replenishing source of capital that required no foreign trade. The tragedy of this period is not just the physical pain, but the systematic attempt to erase the souls of millions for the sake of a ledger. We must confront the reality that the prosperity of early America was tied directly to the clinical, cold-blooded valuation of human life as capital stock. This legacy of seeing people as numbers and assets remains a deep scar on the historical conscience of the modern world. By the year 1860, the economic valuation of the 4 million people held in bondage across the United States reached a staggering $4 billion. This astronomical figure was not merely a theoretical estimate, it represented a sum greater than the value of all the country's banks, railroads, and factories combined. Enslaved people were the most significant financial asset in the American economy, dwarfing the total amount of all currency then in circulation. This meant that the wealth of the nation was literally stored within the bodies of human beings who were systematically forced to reproduce. The financial stability of the entire South, and by extension the North, was anchored to the physical existence and fertility of the enslaved population. Their bodies functioned as a massive, living reserve of capital that underpinned the nation's push toward global economic dominance and industrial power. The role of enslaved people went far beyond simple field labor. They functioned as the primary form of currency and collateral in the Southern credit system. A planter's ability to secure a loan, buy land, or expand his operations depended almost entirely on the number and health of the people he owned. Banks and private lenders accepted human beings as security for mortgages, creating a financial web that turned every birth into a moment of increased borrowing power. Because slaves were mobile and liquid assets, they were often more valuable to a creditor than the land itself, which could fluctuate in fertility. This commodification meant that the financial markets were directly tied to the biological success of the breeding farms and the domestic trade. Human lives were treated as the gold standard of the South, a reliable and appreciating asset that backed the region's aggressive economic expansion. In this brutal financial landscape, children were viewed as the interest earned on the principal investment of their mother's purchase prices. Plantation owners and investors calculated the expected return on a young woman by estimating how many children she could produce over her fertile years. This ledger-based approach to human life ensured that newborns were born into a system that had already determined their fiscal worth and future marketability. When an enslaver died, his human property was divided among heirs like stocks or bonds, ensuring that the wealth of the breeding industry was generational. Families were frequently shattered during the settlement of estates, as individual members were sold off to satisfy creditors or distribute inheritance values. The cold logic of the market dictated that the preservation of capital was always more important than the preservation of the sacred bonds between mother and child. The sophistication of this human-based economy extended into the northern states, where insurance companies and shipping magnates profited from the domestic trade. Northern banks often handled the complex financial instruments and credits that allowed the internal slave trade to flow from the Upper South to the Cotton Kingdom. Insurance policies were routinely taken out on the lives of enslaved people, protecting the investment of the owner against the risk of death, illness, or successful escape. This meant that even when a person was not working, their existence was generating premiums and dividends for a wide array of distant stakeholders. The $4 billion valuation was a national reality, a shared economic interest that made the abolition of slavery a terrifying prospect for the entire financial establishment. Slavery was not a localized Southern quirk, but a foundational pillar of the global capitalist system that linked Wall Street to the slave jails of Richmond. Ultimately, the sheer scale of this financial entanglement meant that the American economy was a machine fueled by the systematic exploitation of black bodies. The wealth created by the breeding farms was used to build universities, fund political campaigns, and establish the infrastructure of a rising superpower. Every railroad spike driven and every factory chimney that rose was, in some way, connected to the capital generated from the sale of human beings. To understand the American economic miracle of the 19th century, one must first recognize it was built on a $4 billion foundation of stolen lives. The interest collected on these human assets was paid in blood, trauma, and the total erasure of personhood for millions of individuals. This legacy of wealth remains one of the most difficult truths for the nation to reconcile, as the buildings and institutions born from it still stand today. Richmond, Virginia, stood as the beating heart of the domestic slave trade, a city whose very streets were paved with the profits of human misery. As the primary hub for the Upper South's export of people, it transformed from a political capital into a gargantuan processing center for the Deep South's labor needs. The city's landscape was dominated by slave jails, holding pens, and auction blocks that operated with a chilling, clockwork efficiency that defined the era. Estimates suggest that at its peak, Richmond processed upwards of 20,000 enslaved individuals annually, sending them in chains toward the grueling cotton and sugar fields of the Gulf Coast. This was not a hidden underworld but a mainstream, tax-paying industry that shaped the architecture and the social hierarchy of the entire region. The city's proximity to both the coast and the inland rail lines made it the perfect logistics center for the systematic relocation of 1 million human beings. Within this industrial complex, the most haunting and specialized sector was the trade in fancy girls, young women selected for their beauty and light skin. These women were often biracial, the offspring of the very enslavers, who now sought to profit from their physical appearance on the auction block. They were sold at a massive premium, often bringing in 3 or 4 times the price of a skilled blacksmith or an experienced field hand. This specific trade catered to a wealthy elite who viewed these women not as laborers, but as high-status domestic servants, or for far more sinister, coercive purposes. The fancy girl markets represented the ultimate intersection of racial hierarchy, sexual exploitation, and cold-blooded capitalism, where human features were priced with a terrifyingly precise market value. This was the most visceral evidence of the system's depravity, where a woman's worth was calculated by the fairness of her skin and the grace of her frame. The logistical reality of Richmond's trade required a massive infrastructure of incarceration, most famously epitomized by Lumpkin's Jail, also known as the Devil's Half, Acre. This notorious site served as a temporary warehouse where families were often held in cramped, horrific conditions while awaiting the fall of the auctioneer's gavel. It was here that the final, agonizing separations took place, as mothers were pulled from their children to be shipped to different states and different masters. The air in these districts was reportedly thick with the sounds of grief, yet the businessmen who operated them were respected pillars of Richmond's high society. To the men running the jails, the screams were merely the overhead costs of a lucrative trade that funded the city's opulent mansions and public institutions. This juxtaposition of civilized society and raw, industrial brutality remains the most defining and disturbing characteristic of Richmond's role in the American story. The Second Middle Passage that flowed out of Richmond was a forced migration that dwarfed the original transatlantic trade in its organized, bureaucratic cruelty. Over 1 million people were marched in coffles or packed into the holds of ships like the Uncas or the Franklin for the journey to New Orleans and beyond. This internal trade was a domestic horror that tore the social fabric of the black community to shreds, leaving behind a legacy of broken lineages and unanswered prayers. Because the trade was legal and protected by the state, it operated with a level of transparency that allowed every white citizen to witness the daily dehumanization of their neighbors. The records of these transactions were kept with the same care as bank ledgers, documenting the movement of stock from the breeding farms to the killing fields of the South. It was a totalizing system that ensured no enslaved person, no matter how young or how valuable, was ever safe from the threat of the auction block. Ultimately, The history of Richmond's slave markets serves as a stark reminder that the American economy was built on the systematic destruction of the black family. The city was not just a marketplace. It was a testament to the nation's commitment to treating human beings as a fungible commodity to be traded for profit. The wealth generated in these auction rooms flowed upward, enriching the entire country while leaving a trail of ghosts across the southern landscape. When we look at the historical records of this era, we see a society that had fully rationalized the sale of its own flesh and blood for the sake of capital. The breeding farms of Virginia and the markets of Richmond were two sides of the same coin, creating a cycle of exploitation that defined the American 19th century. To remember these women and children is to acknowledge the true cost of the empire, a cost paid in the currency of stolen lives and shattered hearts.